In this lecture, we'll be looking at the two primary ways that Muslims have responded to the message of the Quran. The first is legal interpretation based on the Hadith, and the second is the Islamic mystical movement known as Sufism. But first, I can point to one interpretive path that Muslims have generally not taken, and that of the historical critical method. Some aspects of the Quran are clearly in need of interpretation. For instance, Quran 667 allows the drinking of wine. And from the fruit of palm trees and vines you derive intoxicants as well as a goodly provision. Whereas a later revelation, at 2:219, states that there is both benefit and sin in intoxicants, though the bad outweighs the good. And then finally, at Quran 590, there's complete condemnation. O believers, wine and gambling, idols and divining arrows are an abhorrence, the work of Satan, so keep away from it, that you may prevail. So did God change his mind about alcohol? What's happening here? Non-Muslims might see the Quran as the development of Muhammad's thought. They can look to his biography for clues, such as his concerns for the rights of orphans and women might stem from his own early loss of parents and his marriage to Khadijah, an independent businesswoman. And they might also trace elements of the Quran to the Jewish or Christian or pagan influences that he would have encountered in 7th century Arabia. As a quick example of the last, the Quran sees the universe as inhabited by God, angels, devils, jinn, and humans. Now, jinn are invisible spiritual creatures who can choose either good or evil and will be rewarded accordingly at the judgment day, though they often cause trouble for humans. The Quran says that God created humans from clay and jinn from fire. The singular noun is jinni, which is the origin of our English word genie, which you may recall from some stories from 1001 Nights in Aladdin. Orthodox Muslims don't look for human elements in the text. In fact, they oppose the idea that Muhammad had any role at all in the creation of the Quran. It all came directly from God, and the Quran, as it exists today, is an exact replica of the heavenly book that was in existence before the foundation of the world. This is one reason that the discovery of thousands of Quranic fragments in the great mosque of Sana'a in Yemen in 1972 was not greeted with the enthusiasm that attended the Cairo Geniza or the Dead Sea Scrolls. Over 12,000 pieces of parchment from over 900 manuscripts of the Quran were found by workmen renovating an attic wall in that mosque. Some of those fragments have been dated to the 7th and 8th centuries, though they don't have as many variant readings as some scholars were expecting. But even looking for variants among the manuscripts could be disconcerting to some Muslims, since any deviations from the Quran established by Uthman are threatening to traditional understandings of the text. The situation is similar to how conservative Christians and Jews have been wary of historical explanations of biblical contradictions and repetitions, explanations that might undermine notions of inerrancy or the Mosaic authorship of the Torah. Sikhs as well have sometimes been hostile to the historical critical analysis of the Adi Granth. Faith in sacred texts can be delicate, but it can also be resilient. So back to wine. What's the story there? Muslim commentators on the Quran eventually developed the idea of abrogation, that some of the commandments from God had only temporary application, and those could be superseded by later revelations that met the needs of a changing community. This was always a limited interpretive tool. Muslim jurists hold that only about 20 of the Quran's 6,200 verses were abrogated by later verses. So that the Quran, as it finally exists now in its final form, there aren't going to be any more changes to it. It's reached its perfection. But a greater challenge than apparent contradictions was the sparseness of the Quran. It's just not long enough. It doesn't provide enough details for regulating a complex society, or even for many aspects of an individual's life. For help in those areas, Muslims turn to the Hadith, records of the words or actions of Muhammad as recounted by the first generation of Muslims. Muhammad is considered to be sinless, a perfect man who's held up as a model of integrity and good conduct. So believers naturally wanted to follow his example, even in things that might seem relatively minor. For instance, one of Muhammad's early followers reported that he has seen no one more given to smiling than God's messenger. So there's a message there that for those who want to follow the example of Muhammad, we ought to smile regularly. There are other traditions. Anas used to tell of the Prophet that he would visit the sick, attend funerals, accept a slave's invitation, and ride on a donkey. Another, Abu Hurairah, told that when God's messenger was asked to invoke a curse on the polytheists, he replied, "I was not sent as one given to cursing. I was sent only as a mercy." The third caliph, Uthman, said that when the Prophet did his ritual washings, he poured water on his hands 3 times. He washed his mouth, then his face 3 times, right arm to the elbow 3 times, left arm 3 times, then he wiped his hand over his head, then he washed his right foot 3 times and left foot 3 times. So that's the way that Muslims do their ablutions to this day. They follow that same detailed pattern. These stories about Muhammad, what he did and what he said, sound a little bit like the remembrances of Confucius in the Analects. There are literally thousands of these anecdotes, and they provide a lens through which to interpret the Quran. For instance, on women's issues, one can catalog all of the relevant verses in the Quran and then add to them hadith such as, Anas related that the Honorable Prophet said, "He who brings up 2 girls through their childhood will appear on the day of judgment attached to me like 2 fingers of a hand." And another hadith, it is related from Abdullah ibn Omar, the apostle of God forbade the killing of women and children. For believers wanting to know about Muhammad's life, the Quran can be a little bit frustrating. There isn't much in the way of biography. God speaks to his messenger throughout the text, but Muhammad's name only occurs 4 times, and incidents in his life are referred to rather than recounted. The Quran doesn't tell stories about the life of Muhammad. It's only in the hadith, some of which are rather lengthy, that we learn about Muhammad's marriages, his political leadership, or the night journey in which he rode a winged horse to Jerusalem, which was a long ways off, and he met prophets like Abraham, Moses, and Jesus, and then ascended to the 7 heavens before returning to Mecca. By the way, that's why Jerusalem is the 3rd holiest site in Islam after Mecca and Medina. The Dome of the Rock, or perhaps the Al-Aqsa Mosque next to it, are thought to be the starting point for Muhammad's ascent into the heavens. In the first couple of centuries after Muhammad, these stories proliferated wildly, and there was a gnawing suspicion that many of them might be fraudulent. So scholars, Muslim scholars, began to collect and evaluate them in very systematic ways. A hadith came to have 2 parts. The first was the isnad, or the chain of sources, that so-and-so reported that he had heard so-and-so say, that he once saw Muhammad do such and such. These chains of witnesses can grow quite long, and scholars investigated not only the likelihood of transmission to make sure that they all lived at appropriate times, that they could actually have had conversations, but they also investigated the character and the reliability of each person in the chain. The second part of the hadith, the matan, is the story itself. So as an example, one particularly important hadith recounts the circumstances of Muhammad's first revelation. It says, Ibn Humayd has related to me on the authority of Salma, and then there are 4 more names in this chain of sources until we get to someone who overheard a question. I'll continue. Relate to us, O Ubad, how it was that the prophet, the apostle of Allah, upon whom be Allah's blessings and peace, first began his prophetic career, when Gabriel, upon whom be peace, came to him. Said the apostle of Allah, he came to me while I was asleep, bringing a silken cloth on which was some writing. He said, "Recite," but I answered, "What shall I recite?" And then he so grievously treated me that I thought I should die. But he pushed me off and said, "Recite." Okay, you remember this story, right? The multiple commands to recite that will lead to Surah 96, the first of the surahs to be revealed. And then continuing with the Prophet's explanation from this hadith, "Thereupon I awoke from my sleep, and it was as though he had written it on my heart." One of the early collectors of hadith, the 9th century Persian scholar al-Bukhari, is said to have traveled all over the Middle East in search of stories about the Prophet. He interviewed 1,000 experts and heard some 600,000 hadith. Of course, many of those were repetitions or variants of each other. Of these, he memorized 200,000, and then he finally came up with just 2,700 that he thought were unquestionably authentic. Though, when it's put in book form, there are actually 7,400 entries because there are some duplicates. Bukhari published his collection in 97 sections, each devoted to a particular topic. So there are hadith on faith, on prayer, festivals, alms, sales, loans, gifts, war, marriage, and good manners, as well as Muhammad's comments on specific surahs from the Quran. The English translation is in 9 volumes. It's a huge work, and it's only one of 6 collections of the hadith that are highly regarded by Sunni Muslims. The word sunnah, remember, means the trodden path, and it refers to the example set by Muhammad. So the hadith are particularly important in showing believers what Muhammad did and how we can follow his actions. Shia Muslims have different opinions about the reliability of early witnesses, so they have their own collections of hadith, 4 in particular. And the term Shia, as you recall, means faction or party, and there are about 15% or so of the Muslims who believe that the leadership of Islam should have stayed within the Prophet's family. Most Shia live in Iran and Iraq, and they accept traditions about their early leaders, or imams, as authoritative. Now, just to be clear, the hadith are accepted as religiously authoritative, but they're not scripture, not in the same sense as the Quran. The hadith are accounts of Muhammad's actions and sayings, but the Quran is the direct revelation of God's words. So the hadith are never recited or used in worship, and it's acceptable to argue about the hadith or to question the validity of some of them. The relationship of the hadith to the Quran is somewhat like the Talmud to the Torah. Both the Talmud and the hadith are large collections of oral traditions. And remember that there are multiple Talmuds as well. There's one from Palestine and one from Babylonia. And those are intensely studied, those oral traditions, to determine rules and regulations for believers. But the Talmuds are records of legal debates, while the hadith are raw materials for legal opinions. Both Judaism and Islam have relatively small, closed canons, but that second tier of sacred literature is vast. Eventually, the analysis of the Quran and hadith produced Islamic jurisprudence, or fiqh, which offers practical interpretations of Sharia, the ideal of Islamic law. The exact regulations of fiqh are different in different countries in the Muslim world, and leadership in the Muslim community comes from legal scholars rather than, say, priests. And these legal scholars are experts in one of the 4 major schools of Islamic law, at least the 4 major schools in the Sunni tradition. When faced with new situations or difficult cases, these scholars, called ulama, would consult the Quran, the hadith, and traditional interpretations of the Quran known as tafsir, and those are clarifications of grammar and words and meanings and metaphors in the text. From all of these sources, and then applying the typical types of reasoning associated with one of the 4 legal schools, a correct judgment could be made. The hadith and Islamic jurisprudence are important elements in responding to one of our questions from the previous lecture: how to preserve the authority of the Quran while acknowledging that the world has changed in significant ways over the past 14 centuries. When most religious traditions have at least a few passages in their sacred texts that sincere believers wish weren't there. Things that may have made sense long ago, but now seem unenlightened or offensive, or clearly influenced by historical human concerns or prejudices. Perhaps things regarding gender relations or slavery, discrimination based on race or physical disabilities, a preference for monarchy, or divine commands to kill and destroy. Typically, religious people note the historical context of those problematic issues as they try to make sense of them and try to put them in a historical perspective. Or they might look to apply general principles, the essence of the faith, rather than specific details. Or they might posit a progressing understanding of God and His ways. Those are techniques that are used in lots of religious traditions. And Muslims have also taken some of those approaches, though, as we've seen, strong claims of the Quran as to its divine nature make some of that difficult. But Muslims have another interpretive tool at their disposal. They can blame traditional practices that seem unfair or discriminatory in the modern world on the misuse of hadith citations, while still respecting the divine nature of the Quran. As I said, the hadith and fiqh can be questioned in ways that the Quran cannot. For example, Mona Siddiqui, who's a British Muslim scholar, has observed that many scholars argue that despite verses which reflect a male privilege in the Quran, it was not the Quran, but the hadith attributed to Muhammad which promoted female subservience. And then she gives an example from the hadith, where Muhammad at one time was supposed to have said, "If a man calls his woman to bed and she refuses to come, the angels will continue to curse her until the morning." And then Siddiqui notes that these kinds of hadith contradict stories of conjugal love between Muhammad and his wives, and they're in conflict with the essential message of the Quran, which, as she says, calls for mutual love and understanding in marriage, where husband and wife should be like garments for each other. More examples of Islamic jurisprudence can be seen if we turn to the Shia traditions, where they have their own distinctive schools of Islamic law. The Ayatollah Khomeini, who led the 1979 revolution in Iran and then governed the country until his death, first came to prominence as an Islamic legal scholar. In 1984, a translation of 3,000 of his rulings on everyday life was published, called A Clarification of Questions. And those 3,000 rulings included things like the following. Number 2629. It is not unlawful to swallow the food that exits from between the teeth as a result of flossing if one's nature has no aversion to it. Number 2874. It is not unlawful to introduce a man's semen into the uterus of his wife with devices like suction cups. Don't think too hard about that one. Number 2882. When the preservation of a Muslim's life rests on grafting an organ from a dead Muslim, severing that organ and grafting it are acceptable. Now, there are some hadith about Muhammad cleaning his teeth and the way he did that, but obviously he wasn't thinking about modern dental floss, much less artificial insemination or organ transplants. But in the contemporary world, such questions arise, and they have to be answered somehow. Nevertheless, for some people, a religion of thousands of rules and regulations is not entirely satisfying. And that seemed to have been true even for the Ayatollah. In 1989, one of his poems appeared in an Iranian newspaper, which included these lines: "I have become imprisoned, O beloved, by the mole on your lip. Heartache for the beloved has thrown so many sparks into my soul that I've been driven to despair and become the talk of the bazaar. Open the door of the tavern and let us go there day and night, for I am sick and tired of the mosque and seminary." Okay, what is that all about? A man renowned for his strict asceticism has written an anguished love poem that says, in effect, let's skip the mosque and go get drunk. Okay, remember that alcohol is strictly forbidden in Islam. I seriously doubt that Khomeini ever drank wine, but in this case, he's drawing on mystical traditions within Islam. The poem that he wrote uses striking even shocking imagery to try to express a union with God that's ultimately beyond words. So it relies on allegory. The beloved stands in for God. Wine represents God's love, and getting drunk means losing oneself in that love. The mosque and seminary refer to outward religiosity, while the tavern is the divine presence. The mystic strand of Islam, called Sufism, which developed in the 8th century, sought to experience God directly by giving oneself entirely to him and in return being enveloped in his love. Early Sufis were often ascetics, so the term Sufi is derived from the word for wool, the rough fabric that holy men wore instead of luxurious silk. And these men, these Sufis, gained a reputation for purity, and that's another possible derivation for the word Sufi. And they employed music and dancing and poetry, meditation and ecstatic trances, and reciting the names of God as spiritual practices. In centuries when Islamic law was closely connected to the government and sometimes corrupt rulers, Sufi mystics gained popular followings and were crucial in the spread of Islam to Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. Eventually, Sufis were organized into various orders or brotherhoods, though there have been prominent female Sufis as well. Because Sufis emphasized the spiritual, emotive aspects of religion rather than the letter of the law, they were sometimes regarded as suspect by conservative authorities, which is true to this day. Some strands of Islam are pretty nervous about music and such, and dancing, and Sufis use that as spiritual practices. Nevertheless, even though there's some criticism even to this day, Sufi ideas and sensibilities are widespread throughout Islam, particularly in Shia communities. Now, Sufism is not a distinct form of Islam like Sunni and Shia. Rather, it's a mode of religiosity, something like charismatic Christians who are still Catholics or Protestants. Sufis themselves stress the importance of studying with a recognized master, like Zen Buddhists, and they often emphasize the importance of keeping Sharia law as the basis for more advanced spiritual practices. It's not an anything goes form of religion. Sufism is also popular in the West among non-Muslims, in part because of its sensuous allegorical love poetry and its willingness to overlook doctrinal differences in the belief that many paths lead to God, though it's an open question as to whether Sufism can be separated from the Islamic profession of faith. I'm not sure if it works to be a non-Muslim Sufi, but I suppose people have different opinions about that. The situation is similar to the way that Tibetan Buddhism and the Dalai Lama are regarded in the West, where they have a prominence probably out of proportion to their actual role within the tradition. Vajrayana is certainly part of Buddhism, that's Tibetan Buddhism, but it's a minority position. The Quran and the Hadith are foundational sacred texts for all Muslims, with the Quran alone being accepted as God's word, just as the Tanakh and the Talmud are foundational for Jews. Yet Sufism, as an esoteric strand in the tradition, is probably more widespread in Islam than comparable forms of mysticism in Judaism or Christianity. So even though Sufi classics are not scripture and are more highly regarded in some places than in others, Westerners studying Islam are likely to encounter some of them at some point. Consequently, it might be useful to talk for a few minutes about a couple of the most celebrated Sufi authors, Attar and Rumi. Both were Persians from the 13th century, and their poetry has become an integral part of Iranian national literature. Farid ud-Din Attar, who lived from 1145 to 1221, was from Nishapur in northeast Iran. Attar penned a prose account of the lives and miracles of Sufi mystics called Memorial of God's Friends, which is somewhat reminiscent of tales of Zen masters. It's well worth looking at, but Attar's most important work is Conference of the Birds, a long allegorical poem about a group of birds who journey in search of the mythic bird king, Simurgh. They're led by a hoopoe bird who begins by telling stories to talk them out of the reluctance to travel. Okay? The allegory points toward the various excuses that people give for not seeking God, and each bird represents a particular human weakness. Throughout their journey, about 100 stories or parables are told. The birds pass through 7 valleys, the valleys of quest, love, insight and mystery, detachment, unity, bewilderment, and poverty and nothingness. Many of the birds drop out along the way so that only 30 actually arrive at the court of the Simorg, having lost their worldly concerns and habits on the journey. In the end, however, what they find is not a ruler, but a lake, wherein they see their own reflection. They found within themselves the sovereign that they were looking for. The name of the king, Simorg, is a pun for 30 birds. Of course, Sufis, like other Muslims, look to the Quran for guidance, but they often practice the type of allegorical interpretation called tawil, which sought for deeper, hidden meanings, in contrast to the plain sense and close readings of tafsir commentaries. We can see an example of this in Conference of the Birds, where Attar suggests that, like Adam leaving paradise, the man whose mind and vision are ensnared by heaven's grace must forfeit that same grace, for only then can he direct his face to his true Lord. Apparently being too blessed or even too religious can sometimes hinder spiritual progress. Our other example of Sufism is Jalal ad-Din Rumi, lives from 1207 to 1273, and he's even more famous than Attar. Born in Afghanistan, Rumi's family migrated to Turkey, where he became a Sufi and a prolific poet, writing thousands of verses. He was also the founder of the Mevlevi order of Sufis, popularly known as whirling dervishes for their distinctive devotional dancing. His masterpiece is the Mathnawi, an anthology of didactic poetry in 6 books with about 25,000 rhyming couplets in all. The Mathnawi retells stories from the Quran, from the Hadith, the Bible, and Persian folktales. Along the way, it teaches the principles of Sufism and interprets the Quran. So a quotation from the Quran shows up every 30 verses or so. Indeed, it's often said that the Mathnawi is the Quran in Persian. In the Mathnawi, Rumi explores the themes of spiritual yearning and hope for union with God, returning again and again to images of passionate love, intoxication, the ocean, and music. For instance, here's the famous musical analogy of its opening lines. Hearken to the reed flute, how it complains, lamenting its banishment from its home. Ever since they tore me from my reed bed, my plaintive notes have moved men and women to tears. I burst my breast, striving to give vent to sighs and to express the pangs of my yearning for my home. This is the flute speaking, right? He who abides far away from his home is ever longing for the day he shall return. And Rumi is eminently quotable. I'll share just one favorite line. He who accepts everything as true is a fool, but he who says all is false is a knave. As we conclude this section on Muslim sacred texts, I want you to keep in mind that Islam is a large, rich, diverse religious tradition. Don't judge it by the actions of a vocal, sometimes violent, anti-modern, anti-pluralistic minority. Let me end with a story. For many centuries, Timbuktu, in the West African nation of Mali, was a center of Islamic scholarship and learning. Prominent families there had preserved thousands of manuscripts of the Quran, of Quranic commentaries, biographies of the Prophet, and prayer books, as well as secular subjects such as astronomy, medicine, and poetry. Most of these manuscripts are in Arabic, with some dating back to the 13th century. When rebels and Islamist militias affiliated with al-Qaeda took over Timbuktu in April of 2012, they instituted public floggings, they banned music and dancing and soccer, and they destroyed the tombs of Sufi saints. Abdelkader Haidara, the head of a private library, feared for the safety of the ancient manuscripts in the city's libraries and research institute. And rightfully so. When a coalition of government and French troops retook Timbuktu in January of 2013, retreating Islamists trashed the libraries and burned whatever they could find. Everyone assumed that a priceless cultural heritage, some of which had survived for nearly 1,000 years, had been lost. But then it turned out that Haidara had organized his friends and associates. Over the course of 2 months, They had entered libraries under the cover of night and had spirited out some 300,000 manuscripts packed in 1,700 metal footlockers, which they hid in homes around the city. Through the fall of 2012, an unlikely group of librarians, archivists, and ordinary Malians undertook the dangerous task of smuggling these lockers out of Timbuktu and transporting them to the capital of Bamako, some 400 miles to the south, where they would be safe. There are efforts underway now to preserve and to digitize these documents. So it's true that the people who wanted to destroy the manuscripts were Muslims, but so were the people who created them in the first place, who preserved them for centuries, and who risked their lives to save them.